We're standing in City Hall Park. This is City Hall behind me, which was built in 1811 after Hamilton's time. But in the 18th century, 17th century, this area was known as the Commons. This was far north from the city, if you can believe it, because right now we are way downtown in Manhattan. And the Commons was an area where they had public gatherings, celebrations, sometimes protests. It also was where some of the city's institutions were. The almshouse, a jail was erected here, the poorhouse was here. This city also would sponsor sometimes public celebrations, and those would take place here. This was also a gathering place during the Revolutionary era for protests led by the Sons of Liberty against some of the British legislation, like the Intolerable Acts, the Townshend Acts, the Stamp Act. And when the British repealed the Stamp Act, there was a huge public celebration held here in City Hall, well, not City Hall Park, in the Commons. And in celebration of this triumph over tyranny, the Sons of Liberty put up a big liberty pole here in the Commons to celebrate the king, but also to celebrate the triumph over tyranny. And that pole lasted here for several years. It sat here for a few years, and when the Sons of Liberty were rallying people together, as they did to try to organize around the non-importation agreements, sometimes with rallies and sometimes with intimidation, they would gather here together at the Liberty Pole in the Commons. As the movement towards revolution started to accelerate, as the British troops were quartered in New York, skirmishes happened between the Patriots, between the Sons of Liberty and their supporters, and the British soldiers. Similar to what happens in Boston around the Boston Massacre, these kinds of skirmishes happened here, although they didn't end in soldiers firing on crowds, and so they didn't get the kinds of attention that the Boston Massacre gets, and also they didn't have Paul Revere making those engravings here in New York. But one thing the British soldiers did do is they would tear down the Liberty Pole, and then the Sons of Liberty would put another Liberty Pole back up. And finally, in the mid-1770s, the Sons of Liberty put up a giant pole, an 80-foot mast, that they took from the shipyards and they carried here to the Commons, and they dug a hole 12 feet deep and sunk the pole, and they gathered irons around it, and they had a big flag on top that said Liberty, like a weather vane, and it sat here, and it was pretty impregnable, and it sat here for years after that. The British soldiers really couldn't bring it down. It was also in the Commons that Alexander Hamilton gave his first public speech. He was a student at Columbia, or at King's College at the time, which was just a couple blocks to the west of here, and Hamilton was really, even though he was not necessarily a revolutionary at first, and King's College was very much in the loyalist mode. Hamilton really became politicized around that era, or in the couple years that he was at Columbia before he dropped out in order to join the revolutionary movement. And he came here and he gave a speech against the Intolerable Acts in 1774, and it really put Hamilton on the map. Legend has it that he just mesmerized the crowd, and he was pretty much instantly famous as a result of that speech. And that occurred here around that Liberty Pole. After the Declaration of Independence was read out here, after the Declaration of Independence was passed, it was George Washington ordered it read to his troops in New York City. And so they gathered here at the Commons on July 9th. Alexander Hamilton was one of those troops present at the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And this crowd got very excited, and they just marched down Broadway, which is right here. They marched all the way down to the end of Broadway at Bowling Green Park, and they tore down the statue of King George that was in the center of Bowling Green Park. And there's more about that in the Bowling Green Park site on the tour.